Okay, let's pick up our conversation again and start talking about the Australopithecines. Australopithecus is a genus, hominin genus that seems to post-date Ardipithecus that we dealt with before. And Ardipithecus seems like they were still living in forests. There's pretty strong evidence for that. They had some degree of honing, but they were in a bit of wear on their canines. They walked on two legs when they were on the ground, but they had features that were adapted for tree climbing as well. They had only brains as the size of what a chimpanzee would have, and those are standing apes with maybe a changing diet. That doesn't really hint at what is to come, really. But they seem to be the precursor species to the next genus that starts to emerge, perhaps one that started to make more use of walking upright, because the Australopithecus genus, Australopithecines, they are fully bipedal. They are losing that ability to hang out in trees. They also are starting to select larger brains. Or they aren't selecting. Natural selection is selecting that. So they have a slight increase in brain size from the earlier pre-Australopithecines. And they also are starting to have adaptations for a new kind of diet that's quite difficult for other creatures to eat. This is difficult to process things like hard-shelled seeds and grasses that require specialized chewing muscles that are very strong and robust, big, strong molars, big teeth. We saw the emergence of stronger thicker enamel on the teeth for doing that as well. The loss of the honing canines, which is for slicing. No, these become grinding mechanisms with an apical occlusion where the teeth come together like this and they grind, they crush. This is what Australopithecines are sort of being adapted for. Is it maybe a new type of diet that's available out on the savannas, out of the forests? There is still some evidence that there's some Australopithecines are still living in forests, but it seems as though the climate of the earth was changing, and the availability of great new food sources out on the savanna is something that if there was a creature that was able to access that, they could do pretty well. So from about 4 million years ago to about 2 million years ago, the Australopithecines were in existence. And I want to simplify this as much as possible for you, because there's no fewer than 9 separate species of Australopithecine. And it can be a little bit confusing. If you read other reports, you sometimes hear different names used, even sometimes different genus names, Paranthropus and Kenyanthropus. And I don't really want to get too bogged down by these technical discussions. I want to distill this into the most useful information for our purposes here, which is trying to find out how we evolved ourselves. So from this Ardipithecus precursor, it seems as though the earliest Australopithecus is Australopithecus anamensis, which was discovered by the daughter-in-law of the Leakeys, of Mary and Louis Leakey, Maeve Leakey, and she discovered Australopithecus anamensis, which lived in both Kenya and Ethiopia about 4 million years ago. There's evidence that this would have been a woodland environment where they lived, and based on the shin bone and other postcranial elements of the fossils that have remained, this would have been a bipedal creature, and also had completely lost the honing canines, and so these are non-honing canines at this point. It seems as though, however, some parts of their anatomy were slowly changing out of this woodland adaptations. Things like the hand bones, which we'll see in a moment, were only slowly adapting. That for instance, a gorilla's or a chimpanzee's hand bones are in their resting position, sort of like a hook. Ours, if you try to hold onto a branch for very long, you have to really force your hand into that position. Eventually, you're gonna slide off. And as you might expect, something that's sort of part way between a chimpanzee and ourselves, the Australopithecus anamensis and then the next species, Afarensis, have sort of halfway curved hands. And so it seems like they're losing this ability. They're spending less and less time in trees. They may go up into trees to get away from predators at night, but they have, at this point, fully developed foot bones for walking bipedally when they're on the ground. Unlike Ardipithecus, who had long toes and grasping ability, and they really, although they were standing upright when they were on the ground, their feet really had not adapted to that posture to take that weight, so they must have spent some time in the trees. The next species that dates from about 3.6 to about 3 million years ago was first excavated by Don Johansen in the 1970s, who found the very famous fossil that many people know about, Lucy. And this is Australopithecus afarensis. And this is a really well-preserved skeleton, Lucy, which has a lot of elements that tell us that this would have been a fully developed upright walker. So short and stout pelvis, a bicondylar angle to the femur, and aspects of the tibia and the ankle, as well as the foot bones that showed that this would have been a fully developed bipedal creature. But Australopithecus afarensis would have had a pretty small brain, but getting slightly bigger than what you had with Ardipithecus. So Ardipithecus was a chimpanzee body with a chimpanzee-sized brain. But when you get to the Australopithecines, you start to see that they're getting slightly larger brains, about a gorilla-sized brain in a chimpanzee-sized body. And we now have quite a few skeletons and fossil elements from Australopithecus afarensis, which tells us a fair bit about it. That they would have existed in both woodland and grassland environments from about 3.6 to about 3 million years ago. They were bipedal, fully bipedal when on the ground, and had developed feet that was very well adapted for that. But because they had not lost that entire ability, they were transitioning, they still probably might have had some use of their hands for being in trees, maybe to escape predators and that sort of a thing. They were also developing very large molars and very strong jaw bones and muscles, very strong cheekbones, and they were becoming robust for the grinding of hard-shelled seeds and grasses, things that would have been available on the grassland habitats. So things like tubers, seeds, nuts, fibrous plants. These are things that are hard to digest, hard to process, and so you need the physiological capability to be able to access those things. And because these creatures were now moving out into the savanna, they were making the most. Natural selection was selecting those characteristics that allowed for that diet to emerge. Amazingly, the skeleton Dikika, which is a juvenile skeleton that was found, I think, in Ethiopia, has the hyoid bone, which is a very fragile bone in the throat, was discovered. And it was preserved well enough to get some information from it. and it's very ape-like in shape. So we're pretty certain that Australopithecus afarensis was not able to speak the sort of range of sounds that we have. It would have been more gorilla-like in its vocalization. So they didn't have language like we did. Not to mention, its brain size was about 500 cc's, if you recall. Ardipithecus was about 350 cc's, so it's getting larger, but we're still only talking about a gorilla-sized brain and a chimpanzee-like body. And while proportionality of brain size to body size is important, this still is, we're not talking about human level of cognition yet. Also, amazingly, from the time period of Australopithecus afarensis in both Kenya and in Tanzania, fossil evidence for footprints. The very famous Laetoli footprints from Tanzania have been discovered, which show the foot impressions of an Australopithecus afarensis that would have been walking across some mud flats that were very quickly covered by volcanic ash and preserved there for us to find later on. It shows that there was not a grasping toe, and so they were specially formed feet. They walked like us, heel toe, and they put the pressure on their feet the same way that we would have done. And so it seems as though, and actually at Laetoli, it seems as though there was a male and a female, which has a little bit of sexual dimorphism, so slightly larger male than female, as we still have today, but also a third trackway as well, by a third individual without a grasping toe, and so with an arch to it. So this is a fully formed foot. And we have the impressions of these things. Also in Ethiopia, at a site called Bertele, in Johannes Haile Selassie, a researcher, discovered 3.4 million year old fossil footprints that, rather shockingly, don't look like what we find at Laetoli. So they're fairly contemporary with the Laetoli footprints at about 3.6 million years ago. These ones from about 3.4 million years ago look more like they have a grasping foot. And so it could have been that an Ardipithecus-like creature continued on and lived contemporaneously with Australopithecines until later. So Lucy might have shared East Africa with some other types of forest-dwelling hominins that were carrying on. Now, from these two early species, there is another species of Australopithecus called Platyops. This is where it gets a little bit confusing because sometimes this is the Leakeys named it Kenyanthropus. Forget about that. Most people call it an Australopithecus, Platyops. And some of the features of this particular creature is that it had an unusually flat face. It was not so snouty, so the face was more flat, and it had smaller molars. So this might indicate that it had a more generalized diet than this hyper-specialized grinding mechanism. Now that's important because we're going to come in here in just a second. I want to get to one of the most important points of this whole chapter, which is that there are two basic branches of Australopithecines. Now it could be that Anamensis and Afarensis predate this split, or it could be that Africanus and Anamensis, not Africanus, Afarensis and Anamensis are of one branch. We're not quite sure about that, but essentially there is a split between these two groups of Australopithecines. One of them is the so-called robust species. What I mean by robust is that we're talking about bone structure, very strong, very powerful, also very strong muscles, things like the sagittal crest that goes up the center of the cranium, where the muscles, the temporalis muscles, attach to provide a very strong jaw flexing for crushing specialized hard foods. The other, so that's the robust, very specialized diet, getting types of food that nobody else can eat. It's usually fairly low quality food, but it's abundant, and if you have the specialized physiological features to access it, you'll do fine. But natural selection also had another option, and part of another branch of the Australopithecines started to go in another direction, not investing so heavily in the physiology for specialized diet, rather to be a generalized diet where you might not be able to eat the hardest shells and the most fibrous plants or the roughest tubers, but you can pick and choose food from all over the place. So you're not a specialist, you're a generalist. And this generalized diet can also be successful. That also means that you don't have to invest so heavily of your nutrition and your development into creating these huge bone structures and muscle structures in your face and jaws. And it seems as though Australopithecus platyops might be on this more gracile line. So you have the specialists who are the robust and the generalists who are the gracile. And platyops is probably on that more gracile line. And so there's in the slideshow, the slides that are up on Canvas, you'll see a timeline that shows the pre-Australopithecines, and then you'll see a split of the with where Australopithecus platyops and Australopithecus garhi go off in one direction, and all the others seem to go off in another direction. And that's what I'm talking about. Is the ones on the lower portion of that timeline are the robust, and the ones on the upper portion of that timeline are the gracile. And you might notice that that upper portion turns blue after a point. That is actually where Homo, our genus, comes in. And it's believed that we emerged, and as we'll see, there's some very strong evidence to back this up, that we emerged from the gracile line of Australopithecines, not the hyper-specialized robust Australopithecines. So on that gracile line also was Australopithecus garhi. This has been found in Ethiopia, in East Africa, from about 2.5 million years ago, largely from woodland areas. They had slightly larger premolars and molars than platyops before it, but they had long legs. We have fairly long legs. And surprise to everybody is that they so while they had fairly snouty faces like an ape, they had a brain within the range of other Australopithecines, 450, 500 cc's. They had more gracile features. But what was a surprise to everyone is that there have been tools found in association with Australopithecus garhi. So it seems as though antelope bones, not just eaten off of, but with cut marks made by tools that have been found dating to the same time period as Australopithecus garhi. So Australopithecus garhi apparently were the first tool makers of hominins. And as we saw earlier in this chapter, that's an important next step. And as we'll see, this set off a snowball effect that having the ability to have a generalized diet and to use tools to be able to access meat is something that then rewarded tool use and brain size. So the ability to figure out how to make a tool to get to access meat as a food source then rewarded you with being able to invest more in the brain to make better tools that then got you more nutrition, which then rewarded your brain again. And so you have this snowball effect happening where once tool use starts to be a factor in survival, having a better brain to make a better tool then becomes naturally selected as an adaptive advantage. So this is the moment that tools, once they enter into this, and Australopithecus garhi seems to be the beginning of this, then the brain is now being selected as an important organ for survival. And this sets off a whole chain reaction that then eventually becomes us. So the reason why I say that this was a surprise is because we're not talking about Homo, our genus. We're talking about Australopithecines. And for many, many years, it was considered that the only tool makers were Homo. Homo habilis, in fact, the earliest Homo species that we know of, is called Homo habilis because that means handyman. So handyman, we thought, was the first tool maker. But interestingly, Homo habilis starts to use this, or is using the same tools, this particular type of technology called Oldowan tool technology. They were using the same tools that Australopithecus was. So let me put this in order of how it happens. You have robust Australopithecines that are existing on their physiological adaptations to eating hard-shelled seeds and grasses. They have robust characteristics that are being naturally selected for a specialized diet. Then you have the gracile Australopithecines that have a more generalized diet, and they're not investing so much into that physiology that specializes themselves with really strong bones and muscles. Rather, they are eating whatever's available, including, it doesn't appear like they hunted, but when they would come across a carcass that some other predator had eaten, if they wanted to access that meat, they needed to get that off the bone somehow. And they didn't have strong bones, they didn't have teeth that could tear it apart, but they had the brain, enough of a brain, to be able to replicate a sharp implement that they had encountered before in the real world, just a broken stone, and they were able to figure that out and say, okay, if I can break a stone, then I can cut this flesh and get that meat. That then rewarded them with the ability to have access a food source that was very high quality. And that meant that having tools was now part of their adaptive strategy. This was Australopithecus at about 2.6, 2.5 million years ago, started doing this. This then started to increase brain size, and it seems as though Homo habilis, the first Homo species in our genus, arose from the gracile Australopithecines naturally selecting